To the person who has to hide out in silence their tears because they don't want to burden anyone, you're carrying a weight that is too heavy to explain. And even if you try to explain it, people will probably look at you like you're crazy. I know how that feels. I want to remind you, you are a human being and you're going through a storm that will probably break anyone else. So I want to remind you that you are far from a burden. You are a soul. You're brave enough to feel deeply, and you deserve to be held in your heaviness. Welcome back to another video. Your peace is worth the silence. Your peace is worth the silence. The recent video of singer Kellyprice online, I came across it by accident late last night. I love her music, so I clicked and watched it, and it was a pretty long video. She talked about being under attack, spiritual attacks. She mentioned gang stalking, phone cloning, her identity being stolen. And, the message was so intense. Some people in the comments, thought she was not okay mentally, and others knew exactly what she was up against, so they offered prayers. We live in a world that is so comfortable with what it can see, touch, and measure. When you talk about spiritual warfare, witchcraft, or being targeted by the wicked, people who haven't experienced it will label you as insane. It's like this classic gaslighting tactic of the enemy. Remember, if he can make you look crazy to the public, and if he can isolate you, he thinks he can destroy you. But let me remind you that spiritual warfare is not a mental health crisis. It is a reality. Kellyprice mentioned that these attacks were coming from people, her family, who sit in the pews on Sunday. This shouldn't surprise any of us. The enemy doesn't always come with the whole horns and pitchfork. Sometimes he comes dressed in Sunday best with a smile and a scripture. So I hear this a lot online. If the enemy isn't attacking you, it's because you aren't a threat. Why would a thief break into an empty house? They only go where there's jewelry, gold, and valuables. If your life is under fire, if your mind is being attacked, and if people are starting to turn against you, it's because you have something the kingdom of darkness is terrified of. The fact that there is a literal war for your peace proves that you are one of God's chosen. There was one thing I wish that Kelly would have done. I wish she hadn't given the enemy the satisfaction of seeing her triggered. When you're under spiritual attack, you have to understand the intel the enemy is looking for. He wants to know if the arrows he's firing are hitting the mark. When we get online, or when we are screaming at our neighbors, or we go back and forth with people hurting us, we are telling the enemy, you got me, it's working. And we don't want to give them the satisfaction. God is saying, starve the wicked of access. The power of silence. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. To anyone who's been feeling like you're being spiritually attacked, gang stalked, you need to protect your house. Get off social media. Get into your prayer closet. Stop showing the enemy your wounds. And we have to stop calling people crazy just because we don't have the spiritual discernment to see the battle they are fighting. Your peace is worth the silence.